defeats the savages' arguments for why this is a dystopia. The leader of North America points out, well, we want to be miserable and unhappy. That's what your argument comes down to. And everybody here, almost everybody, is happy. So, okay, keep your misery then. Yeah, well, anyway, those are a few comments back on the optimism, pessimism theme again.
I see this integration of perspectives and no clear preference for each also in future studies, where I see a bit of a parting of ways, especially in scenario analysis, with some old traditional structures of around which scenarios are being built. And by this I mean equally Jim Dator's archetypes of scenarios that are still alive and kicking, are still inspiring to many, but also to some extent, well, they are maybe not being sidelined, but they are competing with novel approaches to scenario thinking that does not have to be explicitly positive or negative. And the same goes for the tripartite division, like the good, bad, and the ugly, where really values and preferences are at the core of developing of scenarios. What I see more of recently, and this is frankly speaking also for me individually and for my team at 4CF, the way that we follow is what Rafael Ramirez and Angela Wilkinson present in their book on strategic reframing on the Oxford scenario planning approach, in which, thinking and also in referring back to Real Miller's notion of iso-probabilistic and iso-desirable scenarios, especially iso-desirable, where, starting off with the assumption that something we want to write an optimistic or pessimistic story of the future in our scenario means that we will be limiting the expansion that we want to procure, the expansion that we want to give to the other party, to the client or to the reader, because we're priming them by saying what we believe to be positive or negative in the future, regardless of the values they hold. So we're somehow imposing on them that something is good or bad. Of course, in fiction, it's not much of an issue, because if you disagree with this book, you may either throw it into the corner, or you may keep reading, and it's maybe actually stimulating to see, the silver lining. And very few authors are stupid enough not to give this ambiguity to the story. Yes, this ambiguity is also exciting when you don't know if it's good or it's bad. But I enthusiastically welcome this turn in scenario making that I've seen in the recent years, where we're not chasing, we're not trying to get out of ourselves to come up with something optimistic when we're designing pandemic scenarios for the future or war scenarios for the future, and we're not trying to be pessimistic, because it's the way we should be when we're trying to devise, new work on other topics that are inspiring and optimistic and uplifting in themselves. So this is something I've noticed, and I think this is a realization, and this is a learning that has only become available to future studies professionals very recently, and has always been with the fiction writers and with the authors.
Yeah, can I make a comment on what you just said, Casper?
Yeah.
A function that literature, even science has, is not simply to inform and to stimulate, it's to inspire, to motivate. And so stories can inspire and motivate us. And I think it's important when we think about the value of optimism in our story writing, that we keep that in mind, that one of the significant points of the power of myth was that myth inspired, myth motivated. So whether you're a futurist or a science fiction writer, we need to keep in mind that what we're doing here is having an impact on human motivation. And it could depress human motivation and make us want to be fatalistic and give up and get angry, or it could elevate human motivation and stimulate us into action that is actually productive. So it's important to have a optimistic message in a story, even if we realize that there's going to be negative things, and even if we realize that what we see as optimistic is relative, because stories inspire, literature inspires. And part of what we're doing here is we're trying to move people into an action mode and not just raise their consciousness, if you get what I mean, to get them doing something, to get them creating something.
Yes, and I agree here with you totally, and I would even go as far as saying that when I recently listened to Kim Stanley Robinson saying that the two most important features and most attractive features of science fiction are time travel and telepathy, because, well, telepathy is just part of every literature, because you get into the minds of the either the narrator or the protagonists of the story, or even, you know, looking at it from a completely different angle that you can't do in reality. And science fiction gives you time travel ability that is not available yet to or ever to us in reality. I would add one more thing, something that maybe a Central European perspective, or maybe, you know, just some kind of a legacy that we have or that we share with Karl-Heinz, that science fiction for our part of the world was also, you know, a bit of an escapist or at least inspirational and aspirational part. That the long 60s and the optimism about the future, thinking about the future in an optimistic way, but not necessarily in an official Marxist-Leninist way of future being optimistic because we will reach communism and everybody will be happy and the prehistory of mankind will finally end and we will, you know, live happily ever after. But also trying to see in this, you know, in the stars far away, in galaxies far away, in this more or less optimistic but still different other visions of the future, a way, you know, a springboard into a different reality. Now, I don't want to say that science fiction is therapeutic, because this would be, I think, a little bit, you know, this would be going too far. I don't know. I have never seen a study that would say that science fiction helps or doesn't help people who need, you know, a therapeutic effect, you know, some kind of plaster, some kind of band-aid on their souls, a bond to their souls. But I would go to at least I would risk saying that at least in Central and Eastern Europe, in German Democratic Republic, in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Soviet Union, where Lem's works were published in hundreds of thousands of copies, science fiction in our own variety, because not much of the circulation of the Western science fiction could be limited. It's not like it has been limited, but sometimes could be limited, was also a way of looking for, of disassociating from the problems of here and now, and being optimistic, not in some kind of Pollyanna way, but being optimistic about different reality being possible.
Well, surely there's something true in it. I think much depends on the experiences of the different generations you have, whether the generation itself or the next generation becomes a little bit more pessimistic, optimistic, more open to change, or more reluctant to change. And we had in Europe this terrible experience of the Second World War, of the Holocaust, and of Stalinism, and so. And in the 50s and 60s, we were all in the West as in the East, on the way out of these terrible times. We had springtime in the socialist countries in different ways, and this reflects also in literature. But of course, it would be completely wrong to say that Stanislav Lem belongs to an optimistic strand of literature. He is critical and funny, and he is thinking about deep epistemological problems. A friend of mine said, well, he has only one hero, and that is science. In all of his novels and even in his funny story, science is always the hero. So there it's epistemological science fiction. And even this one can be, for young people, as I was at that time, be a kind of escapist literature. That's so you think about the whole of the universe and you forget about your everyday life with all its restrictions. So, but nevertheless, it inspires. Perhaps one could distinguish different kinds of escapism, but that's a psychological problem. And I leave very luckily all psychological problems to Tom, who knows them much better than I do. So, yeah.
What was the psychological problem?
Well, different kinds of escapism. Literature can help you to escape your reality. And is it good or bad from a psychological side? And my idea is it can be both. For some, it's good, and for others, it's perhaps a way down.
Yes, in fact, I would be a Taoist on that. Sometimes escaping is good if you're too much immersed. But on the other hand, if your habit is to always escape, then it's not good anymore. Yeah. So we need a certain balance. So you should be able to withdraw, but don't withdraw and never come out and look around and see what's going on. Yeah, escapism in a certain amount is a good thing psychologically. Yes, for sure. Yeah, but only up to a certain degree.
Yeah. So I feel
then you become psychotic.
No, I'm still there. I'm still there. I'm sorry. I had just a moment problem. So now, Tom, let me turn to you then. Speaking about this and trying to wrap up this optimism and pessimism, this values question here. You have a bit of a helicopter view on the whole history of future studies and the whole history of science fiction. Which part do you see prevailing? The hope or the fear? Which part do you see to take the upper side and perhaps speak more about the deepest nooks of human soul? Which legacies seem to be more enduring, the optimist or the pessimist?
Yes, good question. Okay. In my book, Future Consciousness, I present the idea that the two most fundamental anticipatory emotions of the human mind are hope and fear. Hope is anticipating something positive, beneficial. Fear is anticipating something dangerous or lethal, etc. And in the history of science fiction, it has been a battle, a struggle, a dialectic, whatever term you want to use there, between the voices of hope and the voices of fear. The voices of fear emerged in early Gothic, romantic science fiction and literature. And the voices of hope emerged in the Enlightenment and Enlightenment-inspired future visions. And it's been ongoing, that battle, since, just like it's ongoing in the human mind since. I'm sorry that I can't say that one is dominating over the other, because these are the two primordial forces in us emotionally with respect to the future. And the future, Ortega y Gasset said, is a swarm of hopes and fears. It's a swarm of them. And they fight with each other. They fight inside of us. So down through the ages, you could say that dystopias don't really come into dominance in science fiction until the 20th century, but that's not entirely true, because there's negative visions before, like The Last Man and Frankenstein. So the fear has always been around. Again, we're dealing with uncertainty. The future is uncertain. Humans react to uncertainty, not just with thoughts and with ideas, but with feelings, and fundamentally with feelings. So hope and fear have been with us and will be with us, because that's really deep in the human psyche. And it gets manifested in science fiction all over the place. It continually does. So there's neither of the two is going to win this one out.
Yeah.
Yes.
This reminds me a quote from Stanislaw Lem that seems to speak about a fulfillment as a writer and a bit of a disillusionment or a bit of a disappointment being a futurologist. When he said in an interview, already late in his life, it was already in the final years of his life, that his in terms of what the different approaches, different studies of the future, I'm definitely trying to differentiate here between futurology and future studies, is the end game is that nothing worked out as planned. Nothing, no predictions came true, nothing. And it may sound surprising in the words of a person who is credited with the invention of a tablet, or with with predicting other different phenomena and devices in his writing. But what he says is that future is somehow weird. It's strange. It's different from what was, and is when it becomes the present, is always weird and different. But it's never what we wanted it to be. Never exactly what we feared. Never a little more or a little less on the scale. But it's always somehow strange and uncanny. One would say, which would mean that for Lem at least, the practice of futurology, one of the two practices that this debate is dedicated to, did not bring self-realization, because he lived to see what the future actually turned out to be. But this, luckily enough, cannot be said of him as a writer, because we still are about to see in the centuries to come which of his ironically, wink predictions were about to materialize, and how.
Yes. Two remarks to this. First, our British colleague Ian Mayles once wrote a paper called "The Future is Fordian." And he referred to a writer, Ford, who has written a book of the damned, and he was collecting all the facts which were against, say, everyday science or the scientific mainstream. And his main idea was that the future will be completely other than we imagine. And not the second remark, not only the late Lem was blaming futurists, also the Lem of the 1970s has read a lot of foresight studies. For instance, Hermann Kahn's famous study about the year 2000. And he was really deconstructing all these important works of future studies of his period, rightly. But Hermann Kahn also said the biggest surprise would be when the surprise-free futures realized. So we are again at the beginning of our discussion. And futurists, I would say yes, when you think about futures literacy, we should always say that we cannot know the future, but we can look at possibilities, at perhaps sometimes at probabilities, and we should decide about what is desirable. And this is perhaps even more difficult than to look what is probable and what is improbable. So that's my experience from many workshops. When you want to have that the participants have a joint opinion about what is the best possible future, they will disagree. You find no agreement about the positive future. And that's something we should live with and we should build upon.
Yes,
Yeah,
and
Big
how,
words, I know, big words.
so now I would like to turn to you, Tom, but also it was not by accident that I introduced these two personas of Lem, the futurologist and the futures and the science fiction author, because I would like to look at this question of influence and perhaps some examples of writers who have integrated the two roles. I've never met a science fiction writer, contemporary science fiction writer, who would say that he pays any heed to future studies, frankly speaking. To science, yes, of course, yes, sir. But to future studies, no, these people cannot be treated seriously. And I've met many a futurist who, upon a slightest mention of science fiction, frown upon and throw up their arms in despair and say, of course, this is not what we are doing. This is serious stuff. This is not some kind of play. But I don't think either of these stances, either of these reactions is very mature, frankly speaking. If you look at people like H.G. Wells, Olaf Stapleton, or Stanisław Lem, so the successful integration of these two personas, people who did not fear influence, but excelled in both of these domains.
Yes, indeed. I have noticed that this is my interpretation. My interpretation, it's a question of turf and ego. And so science fiction and future studies see each other as competitive, and they see their products as more valuable and intelligent and than the other one's products. So indeed, yes, when I talk to some people in science fiction, they have very little knowledge or poo-poo future studies, or vice versa in future studies. But that's not always true. And as you brought up, Wells, who actually, in a sense, kind of invented at least 20th century versions of science fiction and future studies, so practice the two together integrally. So, for example, his magnus opus, The Shape of Things to Come, mammoth work, both science fiction and future studies, and historical studies at the same time too. Olaf Stapleton, integrating together history, philosophy, religion, and science fiction at a cosmic level, integrating them. And what integrate here simply means is that I'm going to thoughtfully and rationally think about the future, lay out ideas as they emerge in my mind, and I'm going to wrap them into various kinds of narratives, or I may reflect on the narratives philosophically and rationally. And so I move back and forth between this narrative and this abstract reflection going on. I would also mention presently people like David Brin and Kim Stanley Robinson are two good examples, I think, of people who are science fiction writers and have a good resonance with future studies at the same time. And there's probably others that are just, Carl Schroeder, who's a member of the Association of Professional Futurists, and he's a science fiction writer. So it's not totally antagonistic, it's not totally ego. And there are a number of different writers who weave the two together. The two as if I could talk about them being totally distinct. How do you take The Shape of Things to Come? Is that future studies? Is that science fiction? Is that is that thoughtful history? What is that? What is that a piece of work? When I read for this event today, I went back and I reread Lem's Solaris. And Solaris is a combination of narrative and philosophy of science. And so we have a abstract discipline, we have a narrative discipline being woven together into the novel. So that's always that will often be there. even though you won't find a lot of people on either end, maybe there's more futurists who say they like science fiction than science fictionists who say they like futurists. That's my impression. I could be wrong on that last point.
Yes. Karl-Heinz, what's your take on this?
Yeah, yes. There's a lot of people who were active in both fields. I would simply add Arthur Clarke, who also wrote several non-fiction books about the future, for instance, Profiles of the Future, or even Isaac Asimov. So we have lots at least of science fiction writers who sometimes made an inroad into future studies. But what was more interesting for me was to see that people like Stanislav Lem took a certain thought experiment and used it as well in non-fiction and in fiction. So Stanislav Lem writes in Summa Technologiae, that's the third Polish edition of 74. So he wrote in it about the duplication of personalities by means of what we call today to beam somebody, like in Star Trek or so. So, and he wrote about it, about all the problems and why this doesn't work, continuity of the personality would be disrupted, and so as a real thought experiment about many pages. And he used the same topic and the same kind of thought experiment in one of the Star Diaries of Ion Tichy. So you can use one idea in both ways, in a more systematic, rational foresight or non-fiction way, and in the science fiction way. And it's wonderful since the results combine into a whole. You understand it better when you read both of them. So.
Yes. Well, I have not been blessed with the gift of writing as you have, Karl-Heinz, as a science fiction author, and I don't think I will ever venture into this. But I can definitely say that in any project where there is also either as a means of communication, when we're doing some kind of animation, film, narrative, even slideshows, simple pan and zoom, so, movies presenting the different aspects of scenarios using illustration, commissioning illustrations, it all gives me a tremendous kick, because then I see that really the boundaries here are only good for the publishers and for the publishing houses and for the librarians. Maybe sometimes even they will be confused, but generally where they should put the book on the shelf. While of course it's not as much for foresight as much for science fiction. It's not the purpose of all this is not to put the book on the right shelf, but put the book into the hands of people and put it into the minds of people, and to get readership, so to speak, technically speaking, but to get someone to talk to through our creation. So this is why I personally, as a futurist professional, as a foresight professional or a futurist, I don't have any problem with influence. As much as I was influenced by philosophers, sociologists, or technology philosophers and prophets, I feel influenced by all the literature I've read, and I don't back away from this. I don't see this as in any way this is in any way compromising for a futurist professional. Well, I'm afraid that we are still about to see that materialize on the other side. So on the science fiction authors to consider future studies as a legitimate thing, but so far, of course, the publishers put notes to librarians so as to help them to put the books on the right shelf. So this, at least this problem is being solved. I wanted to turn to the last scheduled piece of conversation that we're going to have. But before we do so, I just wanted to let know the participants, and we still have almost 50 people participating, and we've had constantly here and on YouTube around 60 people following us throughout this debate. Thank you very much for being with us. please stay with us right till the end, because after we treat the last chapter of our conversation, we would like to open the floor to your questions. We originally anticipated to take questions from the chat, but actually I see that in chat, and Maciek is telling me that in chat you are developing a parallel debate, conversation, which really is lovely. I adore it. I'm very much for it, so that you listen to us conversing and you converse between each other in the chat room. This is fantastic. This is, we couldn't have hoped for more. But we will be giving you a chance to ask us a question, and we're trying to respond to this once we finish this last chapter of our conversation. And for the last but not least, for the last item on the agenda, we've saved something that is particularly close to my heart, and especially it's very Lemian. It's about the balance between humor and gravitas in science fiction and future studies. Sometimes people, even James Dunn in his anthology, The Road to Science Fiction, he put the very ancient, grotesque, very ancient satire from the first century after Christ. It is called the what's it called? The True Story. Yes, the True Story. The True Story. Yes. Saying that this is somehow anticipation or prefiguration of science fiction, or even the first science fiction, that is not religious or mythological, like Gilgamesh, for instance, earlier on. And of course, grotesque is very the True Story is absolutely a grotesque work, and this is, as far as I'm concerned, I don't see it as much as really a science fiction prefiguration or science fiction archetype, rather just as a very good example of ancient literature, grotesque work. So there is this humor dimension. The humor dimension that when you read handbooks for script writers or for creative writers has to be featured some way to keep the attention, to keep the focus of the reader. There has to be little lighter moments, more lighthearted ones, to alternate the tone of the narrative. With Lem, I don't need to say that this humor, and sometimes rather dry or rather bitter humor that he has, is absolutely his hallmark, and it's something that reflects his personality absolutely, throughout his work. But I don't see it as much in future studies, frankly speaking. It's similar to this influence question that we've treated just a moment ago, where futurists seem to be a little afraid of venturing into the realm of satire and to the realm of fun, because it somehow undermines their position as the priests of a very initiated hermetic order of the future, which is grotesque in itself, of course. But some people try not to appreciate this and not to play with this role. What do you think? Should there be more of humor in future studies, and what function specifically does humor and this balance between humor and gravitas, between serio and buffo, play in different ways we look at the future, especially in science fiction? Who'd like to go first? Tom, how you feel about it?
Okay. When you first introduced this question, it surprised me when we were initially talking, the role of humor, because I guess on thinking about it for a moment, I ended up just agreeing with you that I don't see very much humor going on within future studies. In writing about science fiction, though, I have felt often that I need to convey to the reader that indeed throughout the history of science fiction, there's been a lot of notable works that are very, very funny and humorous from different kinds of perspectives of humor. From you bring up Stanislaus Lem, and I think someone or I have brought up Chapek is, I think, hilarious, very funny. Frederick Brown, American science fiction writer, What Mad Universe is funny. There's a lot of humor throughout the history of science fiction, and very little of it that I can see within future studies. Going back to Arthur Koestler's book on creativity, the act of creation, Koestler in the beginning of that book talks about the creative dimension to humor, and that what is funny is built upon a certain kind of creative insight that the joke teller has, or the joke creator. Okay, so being funny is connected up with being creative, according to Koestler, and I could see that. And when I look at the science fiction writers who have been funny, they indeed have been creative in the way they ended up being funny. I think that The Absolute at Large by Chapek is incredibly hilarious as metaphysical humor that we let God loose upon the earth, okay, with the invention of this perfect matter to energy conversion machine. And so letting God loose on the earth was really a bad idea. And Gerald Nordley, who is up here, put up Woody Allen's Sleeper, which is also hilarious too, is another good example. So yes, why in God's earth aren't the futurists more funny? But then I guess I could ask the question, why are practicing physicists not more funny in what they do?
Well, I think they are much funnier. They are actually much funnier than future studies
right,
people.
What about philosophers? Do we have funny philosophers? Do we have funny philosophers? They're dealing with the deep issues of life. But yes, I agree with you. Futurists, I don't ever remember reading a paper. It's a creative act on your part to notice that there's no humor in future studies. It never hit me till you said it, and then boom, yes, you're right. Why is that the case?
Heinz, what do you make of it? Are we going to defend ourselves?
There is some humor in future studies, but mostly not in the reports. Foresight as research or consultancy is a serious enterprise, and no jokes, no funs, no puns, etc. That's quite clear. And if you use satire, humor, or irony, the worst thing is irony. Irony always invites misunderstandings. You want to be understood. You want to bring your message. And in most cases, humor could be counterproductive, since it would give skepticism about the results a boost. And it would, in most cases, not be very good understood by the addressees. But humor has a cognitive function also in future studies. And I see it in workshops. I always try, when I facilitate workshops, to do it not with this gravitas, but to make it very vivid and even humorous, and to invite the participants also to bring in the sense of humor. And for instance, sometimes we want to make the scenarios more concrete, more specific, by writing future headlines. And when we invite the participants to write future headlines, surely at least a quarter of them is in some way funny. And this is very helpful. If one started with such funny headlines, others will follow on, and in the end you have much more ample ideas than if we had done it so very rigidly, what we call this fear side, not foresight, but this fear side. And so the humor even there has a good function. But in communication, and especially in strategic communication of foresight results, you really have to be careful, since everything which can be misinterpreted will be misinterpreted, and the rest also.
This is hilarious in itself, but I that's true that I can't quite fathom the readers of the reports I co-author, or that I put my name on at the end if my contribution is not significant in comparison to other members of my team, then I can't really fathom, I can't really imagine the readers, getting there in stitches and then really laughing their heads off reading this, especially that nowadays I think the anxiety about the future because of the climate change, the climate emergency, and the sentiment in society, generally speaking, is sometimes not very optimistic. So making fun of it sometimes would be unkind toward these people. Okay, let's take some questions. Why don't we take some questions now? Oh, Tom, please say.
One quick point on the thing of humor and futurists. I've been to lots of futurist conventions over the last 25 years. And 2 years ago, I went to the World Future Studies Federation convention in Mexico City. And for the first time, I observed at that convention, futurists dancing, okay?
Wow.
Connects with, that they have a sense of humor or not, because I had never seen futurists having a good time together and dancing. Of course, they had Mexican music, it was great, and people sort of let themselves a bit looser, but this connects with the humor issue in futurists because I'd never seen that before. They were all dancing together. With tequilas, of course, too. Yes.
Yes, which reminds me, of course, of the Futurological Congress of Stanislav Lem and the hashish torches that they had, which somehow served as icebreakers, I guess, for one of the plenary sessions right at the outset. So Futurological Congress is, of course, also a mandatory read if we want to bridge the two disciplines. Okay, let's take some questions from the audience. And I think how we're going to go about it is that we will try to be a little, we'll get crazy, and we'll just you can raise hands if you want to ask a question, either using a reaction in the Zoom menu. So there is reaction, there is raise hand function, or you can just raise hand physically if you are. Yes, Jonathan, please unmute yourself, and can you? And please ask the question. We'll try to oblige. You are unmuted, but we cannot hear you. We still cannot hear you. Please try to sort this out. We can't hear you, Jonathan. Perhaps there is some other glitch. Okay, we'll take another question. We take another question, and please try to sort out this in the settings, and we'll get back to you. So Sofia Kaloterakis is asking us in the chat, what do you think of the climate fiction strand? Okay, I will start on this one because I don't have a lot to say, because I have not read too many of the climate fiction novels. What I'm going to refer to definitely is the Kim Stanley Robinson's latest book, so The Ministry for the Future, that I find, really a great piece of work, both artistically because of that the very, very intricate structure and different protagonists of this novel. I don't want to let out all, but between chapters you see very different perspectives on this, and perspectives that really captivate you and take you deeper on the deeper levels of the climate emergency. But what I like the most about this book is something that is deeply, the kind of provocation that every future studies professional ought to make. Because in his book, he's talking about a ministry for the future that is being, under Paris Agreement, set up in Zug or in Zurich in Switzerland, well, the same area more or less, and that is supposed to coordinate but also sponsor and work on the climate emergency. And what they do is they also have some kind of a clandestine or unofficial black operations branch, which is unofficial and which is of course not, and that gets into climate terrorism. Well, maybe not assassinations, but hostage taking, all kinds of active measures, psychological operations way beyond what law permits. So by reading this part of this latest bit of the climate fiction, and this is an optimistic novel, a novel that shows how geoengineering and coordination and different could work. Well, I'm not saying that I agree that it would work, but this is the hypothesis of this novel. But this hypothesis for me is not as interesting as the fact of a provocation by showing that perhaps this is such a big issue that there are we can allow non-standard measures to deal with it, which is very risky, of course, and all kind of extraordinary plenipotentials are superpowers are very tricky always in terms of government and organizations. But in this case, this read like a very, very good piece of foresight report.
Well, perhaps I can add one word. My opinion is that we have already too many climate fiction novels. That is a large, large strand, and it comes rather late. I wrote my first story about climate change in 1990. And I came late at that time already. So it's now rather mainstream. But of course, it inspires people, and sometimes it brings forward new ideas, and not all of these ideas are really good. I recently read a novel about climate change, and that only an artificial intelligence who takes over control of, say, mankind is able to solve the problem. So we have there also these very simple solutions to the large problem. And it's now already a subject for ordinary thriller writers, and not so much for science fiction writers anymore.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Karl-Heinz. Tom, would you like to say something about this? Or
a couple comments. People often ask about science fiction predicting the future. Well, science fiction also reflects the present, and science fiction reflects the big issues of a particular period. And so over the last few decades, even though we have an awful lot of it, climate change has become a fundamental issue within global consciousness. So it makes perfect sense to see science fiction writers reflecting the concerns and problems of the day to write a lot about possibilities of climate change. Now, science fiction writers also, as we brought out, will often write dark visions of the future. So we could have visions of the future centered around climate change, which are going to be disasters. And that's one of the basic scenarios we see throughout science fiction. Envision disasters from one thing or another. But we also see from science fiction that reflects the present that science fiction writers can be problem solvers. This is Heinlein and John Campbell. Look at the way the world is. Let's write some narratives which address those problems with realistic heroes in them. And what we're doing here is we're trying to work out the possibilities for solving those problems, those challenges. So somebody went, Heinlein and Campbell, are you kidding? Yes, no, I'm not kidding. Yeah.
And Tom, and then call it solution unsatisfactory.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah. Which was for those who don't know, that was a story by Heinlein. In this case, it makes perfect sense to me, and that's indeed what the science fiction writers are doing. Different possible solutions to a challenging contemporary problem.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try to take another question. Jonathan?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Fantastic, yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, this ties in with, Thomas, what you said about problem solving, I think. I'm very hopeful, and I look at one source of hope, and I want your reactions, all of your reactions to this. Is error correction a source of hope here? I'm struck by the ideas of the philosopher Karl Popper and lately the physicist David Deutsch in calling attention to error correction as when we look to the future, we make efforts to cause the future. We can look at it as a series of failures, perhaps, and every time we come to a new failure, we error correct, and that's a source of hope, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes. Karl-Heinz or Tom, would you like to go first on this? This is a fantastic question. I like it a lot because it's really a future studies question, and it's about the sort of anticipatory or cautionary nature of science fiction and future studies, so that perhaps some errors cannot be omitted, but at least we can try to sort out how we're going to deal with them when they happen. Which doesn't mean that we will avoid them, but we will actually be better prepared to deal with them.
Here's my reaction. Citing Karl Popper, where the idea originally comes from, that science works because that we can falsify our theories. Popper turned out to be wrong about that, fundamentally, methodologically. That in science, where we have experiments where it appears that the experimental result contradicts the theory, throughout the history of science, we frequently find scientists messing around with the interpretation of the observation, with the interpretation of the theory. And so in effect, even if you get abnormalities, anomalies, they don't necessarily knock out the theory. Now, we have the belief, as an idealistic epistemological belief, that humans carry with them theories and beliefs, and when they encounter contradictory evidence to those beliefs, they will change their mind like the good scientists. But what we find with humans is that humans tenaciously resist changing their mind, even when faced with what appears to be contradictory evidence, and will frequently come up with some way to explain it away to the point of appearing to deny the absolutely undeniable. We have seen that here in the United States this last year, where the absolutely undeniable was denied. Okay, so it would be great if in future studies and in science fiction, we threw out ideas, we, in a sense, tested them against reality, we saw how reality answered, and we modified our views as a consequence of where we apparently looked like we were making mistakes. And that does happen to some degree. But what also happens to some degree, and let's go back to human stability and security, we resist having our views corrected. We have a great capacity for doing that. Even scientists have that capacity. That's where Popper missed something. So that's my response on that question. But it was a good question, definitely good question.
Thank you very much, Tom. Karl-Heinz, want to say a few words on this? We'll take one more question. We will take Leszek's question after this. So we'll take a question from chat, but now penultimate question and Karl-Heinz response.
Well, only a few words about this. I think as a futurist, I am inclined to a certain degree of optimism about the learning capacity of societies and of mankind as a whole. I know that it's a difficult topic, and even in old Greek times, there was a discussion that the human being can only learn from catastrophes. And I hope so much that we can learn from imagined catastrophes. And this can be foresight. This is acting in an imaginary future to prepare better actions today. So that's my hope, and my fear that it won't work. No, both as you said, Tom.
Thanks, Karl-Heinz. So we'll take the last question that we're going to take is from chat, from Leszek. What is more important for future studies? Looking for new ideas, or developing or building on ideas that already are familiar to clients or this society? Well, I can answer this, but twist it a little bit around. What I find the most important is actually helping the clients or the society, if you're ambitious, to realize that there are some ideas about the future that they already have, and some of these ideas are really cool and can be inspiring, but some of these ideas are really dangerous. And if they are not called into question, if they are not challenged, if they are not reframed, this can be, having these ideas without realizing them like having the emotions without being able to call them by their names, can bring about the demise of this organization, or can bring about a dissatisfaction with the future in case of an individual. So that would be my answer to this, avoiding the dilemma that you presented, Leszek, a little bit. But this is I open my heart here.
Mm-hmm. I have a response too. Is that okay? Can I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. All right. Okay. This question actually relates to the previous question, because the challenge that we have here, and this is a challenge that has popped up in human psychology, which is that we come to our experiences with a mindset, with a set of beliefs. Now, if somebody gives us an idea that's too dissonant, too different from our mindsets, too novel, we don't know how to handle it, we don't know how to interpret it, and we often emotionally recoil from it. So if one wants to present new ideas to people, and I'm speaking as a teacher, you have to take it in steps. You can't throw out really crazy things from their perspective, because as Piaget would have put it, the individual mind cannot accommodate to such a jolt in something so different and so strange, that you have to take it in stages. And so it's finding the right level of dissonance. Too much dissonance, people recoil. Not enough dissonance, and all you do is feed into what they already believe. But people have trouble, again, with the novel and the new. We all do. And so we can't push it too fast, too far.
Mm-hmm.
Karl-Heinz, would you like to give a few words on this?
Well, Ross is the same. As a futurist, you should not walk too far from the mainstream. If you are too far from the mainstream, you lose connection and you cannot tear them into your direction. So you need to be a little bit close to it. But personally, I'm always looking for new ideas. And this is why I am in both businesses, in the foresight and in the science fiction business.
Thanks, Karl-Heinz. Okay, we are a little bit over time, but I would like to thank all of you who have stayed with us so long. There will not be a formal conclusion, because I believe that the debate on the different ways that the two practices of using the future, to employ this term that is central to futures literacy, strand of reflection, the science fiction and future studies, we did not mean, and we did not ask a specific question. None is, prevailing over the other. None is better, none is worse. I believe that we need them both, and I think this has been demonstrated throughout this debate quite clearly, that we need them both, and we should practice them both more. Well, Lem famously said that he hadn't known there were so many idiots in the world until he started using the internet. I'm very sorry that he didn't leave long enough to follow our debate tonight, because I think we would have changed his mind. And but well, it's his bad. He's missed this one, because I would like to thank very, very much Karl-Heinz Steinmüller and Dr. Karl-Heinz Steinmüller and Dr. Thomas Lombardo for participating in this debate and for taking my invitation. It was really a pleasure. I would like also to thank all our participants who's made it, oh, thanks. There, I see some applause in the with your reactions, who've made it to our debate, who have followed them, asked these fantastic questions, and who've been there with us. I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart, the partners who have helped in promoting and bringing about this. So, Association of Professional Futurists, World Future Studies Federation, the Millennium Project, and the Center for Future Consciousness of Thomas Lombardo, and also 4CF, my company that dedicated some resources, and I was it made it possible for me to use some of the company resources to organize this. All this great thanks, but most of all, great applause and great honor to you, Karl-Heinz and Thomas. It was an honor for me to have this little chat with you. If you would like to say some words for the conclusions, make some remarks, or say goodbye in your own way, I think now is the time, because we will be finishing the live stream. The recording will be made available, and of course, I also want to thank everyone on YouTube who was following us without the possibility of interaction. So, Karl-Heinz, would you like to say something for conclusion?
Well, only one sentence from a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Get ready for a surprise.
Thanks, Karl-Heinz. This is a memento for our participants. Thomas?
Yes, actually a little advertisement. I'm doing a webinar series on the evolution of science fiction. And if you're interested in getting involved in it, I'm doing it like every 2 to 3 weeks. Send me an email, and I'll send you information on it, because this is a real love and fascination of mine, science fiction. And if you want to get more involved in it, just get in touch with me, connect.
Yes, thank you very much. Please remember that there is also a link to Tom's Center for Future Consciousness on the landing page of this event that will still be live for some time. We will also use it to disseminate the recording, and possibly, if inshallah, we will see some other outputs of this debate. We will also go scan through the chat and try to look for some gold nuggets from your discussion and feature them on the website. Once again, a heartfelt thank you to the participants, a heartfelt thank you to the audience, and thank you very much, Maciek, for helping in administering this and solving the technical problems at the beginning, because sincerely, without you, we wouldn't have even started. So thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day. Those of you who are in the Western Hemisphere and in the Eastern Hemisphere, have a good night rest, and see you in the future.